And what about the brain? So this is when we get into the clinical data that's now going to start tying all of this together. So the first thing, and this is by Dr. Andrew Campbell, one of my mentors, where they looked at 119 children that were exposed to mold in water damaged buildings. So now we're getting out of the theoretical, like, is this all theoretical? Is this possible? This is real life data. 119 children that were exposed, or individuals, sorry, not children. What did they find? They found, so MBP is myelin basic protein. MAG is myelin associated glycoprotein. MOG is myelin. Look at the immune reactions that these people were posing to their own neural tissue. Imagine the coding of the neurons, right? The myelin is the coding of the neurons. If these core areas, these core codings, these core pieces of the neuron is being attacked by one's own immune system, what does that do to cognition? The honest answer is we don't exactly know. There's something more important in my eyes than even the histamine response. And when it comes to PANS and PANDAS and autism in particular, this piece is probably fundamental to your understanding. So histamine is a really big deal, and this piece is another really big deal. So mycotoxins can cause a powerful, and I highlight that because this is something really important for you to see. They trigger a powerful activation of the neuroglia, specifically the microglia. You may be asking, like, who the hell cares, right? Why is that important? So what we do know is, first and foremost, children with autism have microglial activation. We also have some anecdotal data, we don't yet know for sure, but individuals with OCD, Tourette's, and PANDAS seem to also have a microglial dysregulation. Well, why does that matter? So it turns out that one of the primitive parts of the brain, the amygdala, right, is the area that is really key to controlling our fear response. So fear-related behaviors to dangerous stimuli is ultimately mediated by the amygdala. Stimulation of brain mast cells or the microglia may disrupt the neural connectivity in the amygdala and thereby altering the normal fear threshold. Our fear threshold of the world could be disrupted when mast cells or the microglia are activated. Beyond, and Dr. Theourides goes on to say this could be one way of explaining what happens in autism. Beyond autism, what do we see in these poor children with PANS and PANDAS? Explosive anger, right? Explosive reactions over nothing. They attack other kids. They attack their parents. Their fear response is completely dysregulated. And when you look at this connection, all of a sudden that makes sense. And clinically speaking, one of the things that's so amazing is you control the exposure, because you can't calm down the mast cells in the microglia until the exposure is controlled to some extent. And then you use a compound called Miraca. It's a supplement sold over the counter. It's polyamino amidate, PEA, if I said that correctly, along with luteolin. PEA has been shown in scientific studies to actually downregulate the microglia. And one of the most amazing things that you will observe, and I've seen this now in several hundred kids, is when you use PEA and you've controlled the exposure, what you will see within a short period of time, 2 to 4 weeks at the most, is all of a sudden that anger response, that explosive just aggression, all of a sudden calms down. And that same child is now suddenly a lot more rational. These poor kids don't have control over what's happening to them. These poor kids are not responsible for why they act the way they do. And this is the heartbreaking piece of this. This fear, this insane way of reacting, this irrational way of reacting, this completely distorted way of reacting, the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, is not in the child's control. And when you see this, and when you truly understand this, I mean, one, it's just absolutely heartbreaking, because you look at how many more poor kids are struggling. We have 500,000 kids, 6-year-olds, 8-year-olds, that we put on antipsychotics because they cannot regulate their emotions. We have millions of kids with anxiety disorders, where these children just cannot control their experience of the world. They can't handle their reaction to the world. Their sensory pathways are distorted. Their sympathetic tone is disrupted. Their fear response is disrupted. And it's all rooted in these pieces of pathophysiology and physiology. And when you can start seeing it, you start seeing how the pieces come together. I'll give you a anecdotal self-experience, just for curiosity's sake. I took a ton of Miracle myself, like 5 to 6 capsules every day for multiple days. And one of the things that was so interesting, and I don't consider myself an angry person, but there were times that, like, I would become irritable and I would react, and little things at time were setting me off. And I would, be mindful enough to be like, okay, I've got to watch that thought. A week later, the weirdest thing was, all of a sudden, like, my anger response was gone. And it's not that I would act in an angry fashion, but the thoughts would come. And all of a sudden, I noticed even the thoughts were not coming. That reactivity was not even happening. And that is what's so amazing about this work, that you can use selective compounds, you can manipulate the environment, you can change the physiology to change the entire experience of the human being for the rest of their life, which means you can actually reshape the experience of this child, not just now, but for the rest of their life. And that child that says, I'm bad, I'm evil, I'm mean, starts realizing, like, I'm none of that. I'm a good kid. I'm a delightful kid. And this thing that was happening was not me, because it's not them. It's physiological, it's immunological. And this is why it's so important to understand this. These are other studies that I'm just going to share, where we find that T2 toxin, DON, these mycotoxins, can actually disrupt the blood-brain barrier, which then causes a host of things, as you may know. This is just to say that it's not just one or two things that happen. What is, I think, rather important is when you take the histamine response, you take the microglial stuff, and then on top of that, you look at how, for instance, Aspergillus fumigatus is a rather problematic environmental mold. These molds can produce compounds like ergotamine that further mimic speed. So imagine there's histamine, there's all of these things happening, and these mycotoxins are delivering compounds that we may be inhaling that can further trip up the central nervous system and the sympathetic tone. Ochratoxin, which is very common in food and in environmental exposure, causes persistent activation of NMDA receptors. Now, what are these receptors? These receptors are what mediate glutamate. So what we find is not only does histamine get tripped up, and histamine start causing all kinds of unusual distortions, the other regulator of the sympathetic nervous system gets tripped up too. So essentially, both master regulators of the sympathetic nervous system are distorted and dysregulated at the same time. And collectively, that is what I believe is the root cause of a lot of the anxiety disorders, the agitations, the PANS and PANDAS, et cetera, that we see. These are fundamental physiological things that you will see with your own eyes as you start looking at your patients and saying, why is this child unable to regulate? And then they get into memory learning and excitotoxicity. We'll touch on at least these pieces in a little bit. We see in children on the spectrum that they have changes in brain folate levels, right? There's actually a term called cerebral folate deficiency. And if you do a search for that in autism, you will see an overwhelming amount of information tying upwards of 20 to 50% of children with autism as having this condition. Maternal exposure to one type of mycotoxin increases the risk of neural defects. Why? By binding to the folate protein that ultimately essentially transports folate into the nervous system and ultimately affecting the utilization of folic acid. And these two studies were looking at the higher the level of the mycotoxin, the lower the level of folate absorption into the nervous system. This is terrifying. And when we look at, for instance, these poor children with autism and or others in the psychiatric community, what are some of these psychiatrists doing that are now, trying to be very novel? They're just bombarding these systems with high amounts of folate. And in some cases, they help. In the autism community, we're just bombarding these kids with high levels of folate, and sometimes it helps. We're not asking why in God's good earth do these children need these gallons of folate to normalize their brain chemistry? These are fundamental questions for us to ask because, yes, folate is critical for the chemistry of the nervous system. It's necessary for serotonin production or epinephrine production. It's necessary for a host of other things. Why are these pathways disrupted in the first place where these kids need a gallon of folate? Mycotoxin exposure is one explanation. This is a clinical study, and Dr. Andrew Campbell published some of this, at least in his review. And what we find is children who are exposed to mycotoxins, so these are all clinical studies, have tremors, jerking movements, tic-like motions, and other involuntary movements that may be associated with mold exposure. One of the things that I see, so number 2 and 3, is these children have abnormal EEGs. And I've had many patients where the neurologists look and they say, your child has EEGs abnormality, but this is not epilepsy. I don't know what the heck this is. If you see a child that has seizure-like episodes, but the neurologist then does their EEG, they do their workup, MRI is normal, everything is normal. EEG is abnormal, but it's not a seizure. You have to think about mycotoxins because they can ultimately induce these changes. Metabolic encephalopathy is basically the poor individual where at a metabolic level, their entire nervous system shuts down. If you want to oversimplify it to that, it's if you want to do a search for encephalopathy, you'll see it's a horrendous condition with severe neurological manifestations. Now, what would cause the tic-like behaviors? So it turns out that upregulation of certain histamine receptors can destabilize the cortical striatal circuitry, which is ultimately the dopamine centers, and that emerges as a focus of pathophysiological insight to movement disorders. Histamine is one of the key factors in Tourette's syndrome pathogenesis. And one of the things that I have found in 5 to 10 children with motor tics of all different kinds, address the exposure, control the environment, regulate histamine. And keep in mind, when mast cells are activated, they're just dumping massive amounts of histamine that are hitting all receptors. So it's not just H1 receptors, H2 receptors, H3 receptors. They're releasing mounds of histamine that are overactivating the entire system. And when you control that histamine at the gut level, right, you can use DAO enzymes, and we'll talk on this, and control the histamine at that gut level. By doing that, you actually down-regulate and you normalize the histamine levels within the nervous system, which then allows the resolution of things like these motor tics. Ultimately, mycotoxins do other things. They can cause apoptosis, which is basically cellular death of the brain cells. You can get disruption of the cytoskeleton. You can get inflammatory changes. You can get changes in neuronal plasticity. And again, think of all of this happening in a little fetus, in a little baby, early on. And then think about regressive autism. Kid was more or less okay, and then all of a sudden something happens, their nervous system shuts off or their nervous system changes. If you take collectively everything, not just this, and you don't need to memorize this, but you take this, the immune changes, the histamine changes, the mast cell changes, the glutamate changes, mitochondrial changes, the antioxidant changes, and put all of that at the same time, the clinical findings that we see in things like regressive autism, in PANS and PANDAS, et cetera, suddenly start making more sense. What about cognition? So these are now clinical studies looking at what we see in individuals who are exposed. And again, I just want you to really take a moment, because this is really important, to stand back and just ask collectively if everything that we have talked about, is happening at the same time, how does that impact a child? How does that impact the child mind? So what we do see is in children who had mold exposure in their environment early in life, there was a significant decrease in general cognitive scores, with multiple different ways of assessing that. According to some of the data, that this is another study. So this is by, I wish I could say that last name. This is another study where now they looked at these other children, and these children were being exposed to mold in Poland. And I think just the fact that this isn't just a US problem, this mold exposure is throughout the world. So what they found is the more these kids were exposed, that long-term exposure tripled the risk of low IQ scoring compared to children who were not exposed. And ultimately, they had a 10-point decrease in IQ as a result of this exposure. Now, I believe that this is reversible. So this was presuming that the exposure is continued. It's presuming that nothing is done to reverse the physiological contributing factors to this. But imagine if you had the ability to restore a child's intelligence, to restore a child's capacity to learn, give them 10 IQ points back. How amazing would that be? And this is not a hypothetical statement. I've seen this in my own clinical practice. I mean, the reason why we're all here is because I believe this is possible. And as you become more familiar with all of this, you can actually start creating this in your own practice. Statistical analysis also detected highly significant differences between cohorts, healthy cohorts, and those who were exposed to mold-contaminated environments in neurological symptoms, including brain fog, memory problems, balance issues, hearing abnormalities, and concentration issues. And this was highly significant. How often do you see this in your patients? How often have you seen a child or frankly an adult who is presenting with exactly these clinical findings? These are other studies. Neurological and psychiatric consequences of mycotoxins included moderate to severe levels of cognitive and emotional symptoms, various degrees of altered mental status, faulty short-term memory, blunted executive functioning. Those poor kids that can't sit and finish their homework, and you have to remind them 15,000 times, Johnny, do your homework? Johnny, do your homework. Why are you not doing your homework? Oh, he has ADHD. Altered attention, the inattention, the ADD, short-term memory, where these poor kids just can't retain information. and you have to repeat the same thing to them 15,000 times. We have to deconstruct these diagnoses, and instead of just blanket saying, oh, that's ADHD, that's ADD, that's a learning disability, start drilling down, asking, how is your child's ability to sit down and do some of the tasks that you ask him to do, aka executive functioning? How is his short-term memory? How well does he retain information that you teach him right there? Can he catch concepts real quick? Can he remember stuff right away? How is his attention? Oh, yeah. Yeah. I have to remind him 1,000 times to do something, and he just keeps forgetting. And he's just so all over the place. You will see this with your own eyes. These clinical findings are there all over the place. And you will see these very things in countless patients once you start looking for them. And it's not just one or two things. So this is a cumulative presentation of all of the data that I've been able to find. And you can see it's multiple areas. Short-term memory. You know what short-term memory is tied to? Learning math. You ask enough families, how well can he or she learn math? Oh my God, yeah, he hates math. He hates math. And we have to sit there and we have to keep repeating the same concepts to him so many times because he just cannot learn math. He's just not good at math. He hates math. He says he's dumb. They're not dumb. These kids aren't dumb. They experience something like feeling dumb because their nervous system is not working. It's because their mind is not able to process information, but it's not because they're dumb. It's not because they can't learn. It's because their nervous system is shut down. And one of the things that I've added is a lot of these kids also present with visual tracking errors. So what you see over there with visual spatial memory and learning is ultimately related to a child's ability to read and have good reading comprehension. Another thing you'll see is a lot of times these kids have a difficult time with reading. And more importantly, sometimes they can read fine, but their reading comprehension is altered. And all of this is really important. And as you start seeing these things, it becomes critical to figuring out how to help these kids. Some of these studies go on to say that there's reduced cognitive functioning in multiple areas, and memory and executive functioning are areas that are most affected. And I'm reiterating this because I really want to impress upon you that everything that we've talked about is not abstract. As you take all of these core physiological things that we talked about and think about the mitochondrial damage and ultimately the brain inflammation, damage to the myelin proteins, and on and on and on. And now you stand back and you say, okay, how does this look? Oh, memory is affected. And these are clinical studies. These are individuals, these children that are exposed to mold, that we see the actual clinical findings. Cognitive impact is oftentimes extensive. And sadly, it's no different than those who have had traumatic brain injury. It's that serious. It's that real. And the most beautiful part of it is you can do something about this. You can prevent it if you catch it early enough. You can treat it. You can mostly reverse it. And it just comes to you becoming familiar enough with this information to know what to do with it. Now, you may be asking, what is the exact cause of all of these cognitive changes? Like, how does all of that information translate into the neuroscience to then translate into the clinical data? No one knows. I have yet to find a study that helps actually translate all of that into what we see in real life. No one knows. And I certainly don't pretend to know. There's a lot of clinical observations that I have made that I will share with you. Are these clinical observations 100% accurate? Probably not. It is the best we have, and it is what I can share with you. But really stand back and ask, like, when all of this comes together, what does that do to a child? And when you have multiple things layered on top of each other, what does that do to the child?